Missouri, 2007. A 9-year-old girl vanishes before sunrise. By nightfall, 2 grown men have confessed, but investigators quickly realize something is very wrong. The evidence points in only one direction, and it isn't the man who confessed first. This is the story of Rowan Ford, a 4th-grade girl with a bright smile and a love of purple, whose life was stolen on a cold November night. It's the story of 2 men who confessed to her murder. And it's the story of a confession that may have been false, physical evidence that told contradictory tales, and justice that 17 years later still feels incomplete. Welcome to Cold Case Desk. I'm your host, and today we're examining one of Missouri's most complex and controversial murder cases, a case where the truth proved more elusive than anyone could have imagined. To understand what happened to Rowan Ford, we must first understand who she was. Born on April 11th, 1998, Rowan Ford came into a world that would show her both love and neglect, protection and danger, hope and ultimately, betrayal. Stella, Missouri, is the kind of place most people pass through without noticing. Nestled in the southwestern corner of the state, fewer than 200 people call this unincorporated community home. There's no main street lined with shops, no town square with a courthouse, just scattered houses along rural roads, where neighbors know each other's business and strangers are noticed immediately. Rowan lived with her mother, Collings and Rowan, and her stepfather, David Spears, in a modest home on Farm Road 1185. The property sat on the outskirts of what little there was of Stella, surrounded by the forests and fields that characterize Newton County. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that city dwellers find peaceful and rural residents simply call normal. At 9 years old, Rowan was in 4th grade at Triway Elementary School, located in the nearby town of Washburn. To her teachers, she was a star student, bright, engaged, and eager to learn. Todd Holt, her teacher, would later describe a girl who lit up the classroom with her enthusiasm. She loved reading, excelled in math, and had a particular fondness for art projects that allowed her creativity to shine. She was always smiling, Holt recalled. Even when things were difficult at home, she came to school with this determination to make the day good. Tammy Marshall, another teacher at Triway Elementary, remembered Rowan's resilience. Some children wear their struggles on their sleeves. Rowan tried to hide hers. She wanted so badly to be just like the other kids. But Rowan wasn't like the other kids, not entirely. There were signs small at first, then increasingly impossible to ignore, that all was not well in the Ford household. Teachers noticed that Rowan often arrived at school early, sometimes well before the building opened. She would wait outside, even in cold weather, rather than stay home those extra minutes. Her hair was frequently matted and unwashed, tangled in ways that suggested days without proper care. School staff documented multiple instances of head lice, a problem that seemed to recur despite treatment. In the bitter Missouri winter, Rowan sometimes came to school without socks, her small feet visible through worn shoes. Teachers quietly provided what they could, extra supplies, gentle encouragement, and the kind of attention that becomes a lifeline for a child who feels invisible at home. The hotline to Child Protective Services received calls about the lice, about the general signs of neglect. Each time, the system responded to the immediate problem, treating the lice, ensuring basic hygiene, without digging deeper into what these symptoms might indicate. No one connected the dots. No one asked the harder questions about what was happening behind closed doors on Farm Road 1185. Rowan's family structure was complicated in the way many modern families are. Collings and Rowan had children from previous relationships. Ariane, Rowan's older sister, was already an adult by 2007, living her own life. The sisters shared a bond that distance couldn't diminish. Ariane would later describe Rowan as her ray of sunshine, the little sister who could brighten even the darkest days with her infectious laugh and boundless optimism. David Spears entered Rowan's life when he married her mother. He wasn't her biological father, but in a child's world, titles matter less than presence. Spears was there, in the house, a fixture in her daily existence. Whether he filled the role of protector or something else entirely would become one of the central questions of this case. Outside of school, Rowan's world was small. The family attended Stella Baptist Church, a white-framed building that served as one of the few community gathering places in the area. Church meant Sunday school, potluck dinners, and the kind of small-town social structure where everyone knew everyone else's children. It also meant exposure to people her family trusted or should have been able to trust. Christopher Collings was known to Rowan as Uncle Chris, though they shared no blood relation. Collings had been friends with David Spears for approximately 10 years by 2007. More than a friend, Collings had become something of a fixture in the Ford household. During the summer and fall of 2007, Collings lived with the family, sleeping on their couch, sharing their meals, becoming part of their daily routine. To Rowan, he was a familiar presence, someone who was simply there, part of the landscape of her childhood, someone her family trusted, someone she had no reason to fear. The tragedy of Rowan Ford's story is that the danger didn't come from a stranger lurking in the shadows. It came from within the circle of trust, from the very people who should have protected her. Rowan's daily routine in the fall of 2007 followed a predictable pattern. Weekday mornings meant getting ready for school, the yellow bus ride to Triway Elementary, and hours spent in Todd Holt's fourth-grade classroom. She excelled in reading, often finishing books ahead of her classmates. Math came easily to her, numbers and logic puzzles that she solved with the kind of concentration that blocked out everything else. During lunch and recess, Rowan played with her best friend, Tyler. The two were inseparable, sharing secrets and dreams the way 9-year-olds do. Tyler would later struggle to articulate what made their friendship special, finally settling on the simplest truth: she was my best friend. That's all that mattered. After school, the bus brought Rowan back to the isolation of rural Newton County. Homework at the kitchen table, maybe some television, dinner if her mother was home from work. The evenings stretched long in the Missouri countryside, where darkness falls early in November, and entertainment means finding ways to occupy yourself without the distractions of suburban or urban life. Colleen Munson worked the night shift at Walmart, a reality that meant Rowan was often in David Spears' care during the evening hours. When Collings was staying with them, he was there too, another adult presence in a house that should have been safe. Should have been. The records show that Rowan was a child who loved purple, her favorite color, the shade that decorated her school supplies, and the clothes she chose when given the option. She liked animals, particularly dogs, and harbored dreams of becoming a veterinarian when she grew up. She wanted to help creatures who couldn't help themselves, to be the kind of person who made things better. She never got the chance. In retrospect, those who knew Rowan would scrutinize every interaction, every conversation, searching for warning signs they might have missed. Had she seemed afraid? Had she tried to tell someone what was happening? Had there been opportunities to intervene that went unrecognized? The truth is more complicated and more painful. Children in neglectful situations often normalize their circumstances. What adults recognize as red flags, children experience as simply the way things are. Rowan adapted to her environment because that's what children do. They survive the childhood they're given and hope for better tomorrow. But for Rowan Ford, there would be no tomorrow after November 3, 2007. The weeks leading up to that night showed no dramatic shift in routine, no obvious precursor to tragedy. Life continued its normal pattern in Stella school days and church Sundays, David Spears and Christopher Collings drinking together in the evenings, Colleen working her shifts at Walmart to keep the bills paid. Looking back, residents of Stella would describe the fall of 2007 as unremarkable. Harvest season had passed. The landscape had shifted from autumn colors to the bare branches of early winter. Temperatures dropped into the 40s and 30s at night. Life moved at the slow, predictable pace of rural Missouri. Nothing seemed wrong. Nothing seemed different. And then, in a single night, everything changed. The last time Todd Holt saw Rowan Ford alive, she was leaving Triway Elementary on the afternoon of Friday, November 2, 2007. She climbed onto the yellow bus with her backpack and homework, gave him the same wave she always did, and headed home for the weekend. Holt didn't know he would never see that wave again. Didn't know that by Monday morning, when Rowan's desk sat empty, an entire community's sense of safety would be shattered. November 3, 2007, began as an ordinary Saturday in Stella, Missouri. The temperature hovered in the low 40s, cool enough to need a jacket, but not the bitter cold that would arrive in the coming weeks. The sun rose over the bare trees and empty fields, casting pale light across a landscape, preparing for winter. Inside the Ford home on Farm Road 1185, the day unfolded in what would later be described as a typical pattern for the household. David Spears was home. Christopher Collings was there as well, still staying with the family as he had been for months. Rowan moved through her Saturday, perhaps watching television, perhaps playing in her room, perhaps hoping for something more exciting than the quiet isolation of rural Missouri offered a 9-year-old girl. Colleen Munson prepared for her evening shift at Walmart. Working nights meant missing the traditional family evening hours. But bills don't pay themselves. And in places like Stella, you take the work you can get. The night shift paid a bit more, and every dollar mattered. By all accounts, nothing seemed amiss that afternoon. Nothing alarmed Colleen enough to change her plans or call into work. Nothing made her feel her daughter was in danger. At approximately 8:30 in the evening, Colleen left for her shift at the Walmart in nearby Neosho. She worked until the early morning hours, part of the army of overnight workers who stock shelves and clean floors and keep retail operations running while most people sleep. She left Rowan in the care of David Spears, her husband. She left Rowan in a house where Christopher Collings was also present. She left assuming her daughter would be safe, that she would come home in the morning to find Rowan sleeping peacefully. That Sunday would dawn with the same ordinary rhythms as any other day. That's not what happened. According to Christopher Collings' later confession, a statement that would be dissected, analyzed, and used to convict him of capital murder, the events that followed Colleen's departure unfolded with horrifying speed. Collings claimed that he and David Spears spent the evening drinking beer, whiskey, enough alcohol to impair judgment and lower inhibitions. Nathan Mahurin, another acquaintance, may have been present for part of the evening as well. 3 men drinking in a house where a 9-year-old girl should have been protected. At some point, Collings would later say around 9 or 9:30 in the evening, David Spears allegedly left the house. He didn't take Rowan with him. He simply left, driving away in his vehicle, leaving his stepdaughter alone with Christopher Collings. Or at least, that's what Collings told investigators. What happened next depends entirely on whose version of events you believe. And in the Rowan Ford case, the versions diverge so dramatically that reconciling them becomes impossible. According to Collings' confession, once Spears left, he went into Rowan's bedroom. The girl was preparing for bed, or perhaps already asleep. What should have been the safest place in her world, her own bedroom, in her own home, became the scene of unimaginable violence. Collings said he sexually assaulted Rowan. The medical evidence would later confirm that she suffered severe trauma, a 3/4 of an inch laceration to her vaginal area, injuries consistent with forcible rape. For a 9-year-old child, the physical damage alone would have been excruciating. But Collings didn't stop with the assault. According to his confession, he strangled Rowan Ford. He used his hands or a ligature, the exact method would be debated, but the result was indisputable. He applied pressure to her small neck until she could no longer breathe, until her brain was deprived of oxygen, until her heart stopped beating. He murdered a 9-year-old girl in her own bedroom while she should have been under his protection. Collings then said he wrapped Rowan's body in bedding and carried her to his truck. He drove through the dark Newton County roads to a remote location he knew well, an area near Wheaton where limestone sinkholes pockmarked the landscape, left over from centuries of water erosion, creating the karst topography that characterizes this region. One of these sinkholes was known locally as Fox Cave. Not a traditional cave with horizontal passages, but a vertical shaft that dropped into darkness, the kind of place local kids might dare each other to explore, where hunters and hikers occasionally ventured, where someone looking to hide evidence might believe a body would never be found. Collings claimed he threw Rowan's body into Fox Cave, disposing of her like she was nothing more than trash to be hidden. Then he returned home, Collings said. He burned the mattress from Rowan's bed, physical evidence of the crime. He burned her clothing. He attempted to erase the traces of what he had done. When David Spears allegedly returned home hours later, Collings told him what had happened. Or perhaps Spears already knew. Or perhaps Spears was involved from the beginning. This is where the story becomes impossible to verify, where 2 confessions contradict each other, where physical evidence points in multiple directions, and where the truth remains frustratingly elusive. Because David Spears also confessed to killing Rowan Ford. Spears told investigators that he participated in the murder, that both he and Collings were responsible, that they acted together in assaulting and killing his stepdaughter. He provided details. He expressed remorse. He admitted to being present and involved. But there was a problem. There wasn't a single piece of physical evidence connecting David Spears to Rowan's sexual assault or murder. Not one fiber, not one hair, not one trace of DNA. Not one forensic finding that placed him at the scene of the crimes his own mouth confessed to committing. 3 separate laboratories, the FBI, the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and an independent facility, examined every piece of evidence collected in this case. All 3 reached the same conclusion. There was no physical evidence implicating David Spears in the sexual assault or murder of Rowan Ford. In fact, medical evidence excluded him as the perpetrator of the sexual assault. Spears had undergone a vasectomy. The forensic examination of Rowan's body and the evidence collected during her autopsy were inconsistent with Spears being the rapist. So, why did he confess? That question would haunt this case for years. It would influence charging decisions. shape legal strategy, and ultimately result in one of the most controversial aspects of an already controversial case. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to that Saturday night, to the hours when Rowan Ford disappeared and no one yet knew she was gone. The timeline, reconstructed from phone records, witness statements, and surveillance footage, reveals critical gaps, periods of time that remain unexplained even now. David Spears left the house around 1:30 in the morning on Sunday, November 4th. Where did he go? He wouldn't provide a clear answer. He was gone for approximately 5.5 hours, an extraordinary length of time for a middle-of-the-night excursion with no explanation. He returned around 7 in the morning. Rowan was gone from her bedroom, but according to Spears' own statement, he didn't immediately report her missing. In fact, hours passed before anyone contacted law enforcement. Colleen Munson returned home from her overnight shift at Walmart sometime that Sunday morning. Different accounts place her arrival between 7 and 9 in the morning. She found David Spears at home. She found Christopher Collings there as well. She didn't find Rowan. What happened in those next hours would become another source of confusion and controversy. Who realized Rowan was missing? When did they realize it? What did they do about it? The official missing person report wasn't filed until 6:50 in the evening on Sunday, November 4th, approximately 8 to 10 hours after Colleen arrived home, depending on which timeline you accept. 8 to 10 hours. That's an extraordinarily long delay for parents to wait before reporting their child missing. In most cases of child abduction or disappearance, parents call 911 within minutes of discovering their child gone. The immediate response can mean the difference between life and death. But in this case, the better part of an entire day passed before law enforcement was notified that Rowan Ford had vanished. Why? Colleen Munson would later struggle to explain the delay. She told investigators that she initially thought Rowan might be at a friend's house or with relatives. She said she and David spent the day trying to locate Rowan themselves before involving police. But Newton County is small. Stella is tiny. Rowan's world was limited. A few phone calls should have exhausted the possibilities within minutes, not hours. Some investigators suspected the delay indicated guilt that the adults in the house knew Rowan was dead and were scrambling to construct a story before involving authorities. Others believed the delay reflected the chaotic dysfunction of the household, where crisis response was as disorganized as everyday life. Whatever the reason, by the time Newton County Sheriff's Department received the missing person report, Rowan had been dead for nearly 24 hours. The call came in at 6:50 p.m. on Sunday, November 4th, 2007. A 9-year-old girl, last seen in her bedroom the previous evening, had disappeared from her home in Stella, Missouri. The responding deputies arrived at the Ford home to find David Spears and Colleen Munson in various states of distress. Colleen was described as distraught, crying, clearly upset. Spears appeared nervous, his story inconsistent, and shifting under even basic questioning. Christopher Collings was also present, and he too spoke with investigators. All three adults claimed to have no idea what had happened to Rowan. They suggested she might have run away, though that seemed unlikely for a 9-year-old girl in rural Missouri in November. They speculated about possible abduction, though there were no signs of forced entry and no evidence of a struggle. The scene, investigators would later note, didn't feel right. Something was off, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough to raise the instincts of experienced law enforcement officers. Sheriff Chris Jennings responded personally to the call. A veteran lawman with decades of experience, Jennings had handled countless investigations in Newton County. But something about this case immediately struck him as different. When I arrived at that house, Jennings would later recall, I knew we weren't looking for a runaway. I knew something terrible had happened to that little girl. Deputies began interviewing the family members separately, a standard procedure designed to identify inconsistencies in their accounts. They walked through the house, looking for clues about what might have happened. They examined Rowan's bedroom. That's when they noticed something odd. The mattress from Rowan's bed was missing. In its place was a different mattress, one that didn't match the bed frame. When asked about it, David Spears and Christopher Collings provided vague, contradictory explanations. The original mattress had been soiled, they said. It had been disposed of, burned, perhaps, or taken to a dump. Why would you burn a mattress in the middle of the night when your daughter goes missing? The answer seemed obvious, and it was one that turned a missing person case into a criminal investigation within hours. By late Sunday evening, Sheriff Jennings had made several critical decisions. First, this was not a runaway situation. Rowan Ford was the victim of foul play. Second, the people most likely responsible for her disappearance were the adults in her own household. Third, he needed help. Newton County Sheriff's Department is small, equipped to handle rural crime, but not the kind of major investigation this case demanded. Jennings reached out to multiple agencies, requesting assistance with what he suspected would be a murder investigation, even though no body had been found. The FBI responded immediately, dispatching approximately 40 agents to Newton County. The Berry County Sheriff's Department sent investigators. The Wheaton Police Department, serving the tiny town of fewer than 700 people, located about 10 miles from Stella, provided support. What began as a missing person report at 6:50 p.m. on November 4th became, by Monday morning, one of the largest criminal investigations southwestern Missouri had seen in years. Law enforcement established a command center. They began coordinating searches of the rural areas surrounding Stella. They interviewed neighbors, teachers, anyone who had contact with Rowan or her family. And they began systematically dismantling the stories told by David Spears and Christopher Collings. Both men agreed to speak with investigators without attorneys present. Both provided statements that were recorded, documented, and would later be used against them in court. Initially, both Spears and Collings maintained they had no knowledge of what happened to Rowan. She had been in her bedroom Saturday night. By Sunday morning, she was gone. They assumed she had run away or been abducted by someone outside the family. But their stories contained inconsistencies, small at first, then growing more pronounced under sustained questioning. Collings claimed he had been drinking and passed out, remembering little of Saturday night. Spears said he had left the house in the early morning hours, but couldn't or wouldn't explain where he went or why. Colleen maintained she had been at work the entire time and knew nothing until she returned home to find her daughter missing. As Monday stretched into Tuesday, law enforcement pressure intensified. FBI behavioral analysts joined the interrogations, applying psychological techniques designed to break through deception. The interviews grew longer, more confrontational, more focused on the contradictions. During this period, investigators also began processing the Ford home as a crime scene. They collected physical evidence, fibers, hairs, fluids, anything that might tell them what had happened in that house. They dismantled Rowan's bedroom inch by inch, looking for traces of violence. They found evidence of cleanup signs that someone had scrubbed surfaces, attempted to remove blood or other biological material. They found burn residue consistent with cloth or fabric having been destroyed. They found, in short, exactly what you would expect to find if someone had committed a violent crime and then tried to cover it up. What they didn't find was Rowan. By Wednesday, November 7th, 3 days after Rowan was reported missing, search teams had covered hundreds of acres around Stella and Wheaton. Volunteers from the community joined law enforcement in combing through fields and forests, checking abandoned buildings, searching anywhere a small body might be hidden. The temperature had dropped further. The forecast called for rain and possibly snow. Time was running out not to save Rowan, because by this point, investigators privately acknowledged she was almost certainly dead, but to find her body before weather and wildlife destroyed evidence. The case reached a turning point on November 8th when two key relationships were exploited to break through the suspect's denials. Clinton Clark, the chief of police for Wheaton, had known Christopher Collings for approximately 17 years. They weren't just acquaintances, they were friends, or at least friendly enough that Collings trusted Clark in ways he wouldn't trust a stranger. Clark volunteered to interview Collings, believing he could use their personal connection to extract the truth. Similarly, Mark Bridges, the Newton County coroner and a part-time pastor, had employed David Spears as a carpenter. Bridges knew Spears personally, had worked alongside him, had developed a relationship that went beyond professional obligation. When investigators asked Bridges to participate in Spears' interrogation, he agreed. Both Clark and Bridges wore FBI wires during these conversations. Both used their personal relationships to manipulate the suspects into confessing. The ethics of these tactics would later be questioned. Using personal relationships and positions of trust to extract confessions walks a fine line between effective interrogation and coercion. Defense attorneys would argue that both men were psychologically manipulated into confessing to crimes, or in Spears' case, to crimes he didn't actually commit. But on November 8th and 9th, 2007, those concerns were secondary to one goal: finding Rowan Ford. Chief Clark spoke with Christopher Collings late into the night on November 8th. He appealed to their friendship, to Collings' conscience, to whatever shred of humanity might compel him to reveal what had happened. He suggested that confession might bring peace, that carrying this secret would destroy Collings from the inside out. Around the same time, Mark Bridges sat with David Spears and employed what would later be characterized as spiritual manipulation. As a pastor, Bridges had authority that transcended law enforcement. He talked about redemption, about the importance of truth, about facing judgment before God. He suggested that confessing might save Spears' soul, even if it couldn't save his freedom. Both approaches worked. On Friday, November 9th, 6 days after Rowan disappeared, Christopher Collings broke. He admitted to Chief Clark that he had sexually assaulted and murdered Rowan Ford. He described what he had done in her bedroom. He explained how he had disposed of her body. And he told them where to find her. That same day, David Spears also confessed to Mark Bridges. But his confession differed from Collings in critical ways. Spears claimed he had participated in the murder, that both he and Collings had acted together, that he bore responsibility for his stepdaughter's death. Prosecutors would later face an impossible situation, two men confessing to the same murder, but with contradictory accounts that couldn't both be true, and physical evidence that supported only one version. But first, they had to find Rowan. Using the information Christopher Collings provided, deputies Jake Bowles and Mike Hall drove to the area near Wheaton where Fox Cave was located. The property was remote, accessible only by dirt roads that became muddy trails in wet weather. Fox Cave itself was unremarkable from a distance, just another depression in the limestone terrain, easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking for. The deputies approached carefully, aware they were likely approaching a crime scene. They peered over the edge of the sinkhole, into the vertical shaft that dropped into darkness. At the bottom, approximately 40 to 50 feet below ground level, they saw what appeared to be a body wrapped in fabric. It was Friday afternoon, November 9th, 2007. Rowan Ford had been found. The discovery of Rowan's body at Fox Cave marked a shift from desperate hope to grim certainty. For 6 days, there had been the slim possibility that she was alive somewhere, that the case might somehow resolve without the worst outcome. That hope died when deputies Jake Bowles and Mike Hall confirmed what they saw at the bottom of the sinkhole. Recovering a body from a vertical shaft 40 to 50 feet deep presents significant logistical challenges. Fox Cave wasn't a traditional cave with walkable passages. It was essentially a straight drop into a karst void created by limestone dissolution over millennia. The walls were rough stone, offering few handholds. The bottom was uneven, strewn with rocks and debris that had fallen or been thrown in over the years. And somewhere in that dark, cold space lay the remains of a 9-year-old girl. Law enforcement immediately secured the scene, establishing a perimeter around Fox Cave to preserve evidence and prevent contamination. The FBI's evidence response team was called in, along with specialized recovery personnel trained in vertical rope work and confined space rescue. This wasn't just about retrieving a body, it was about ensuring that every piece of potential evidence was documented, collected, and preserved for the investigation and trial that would inevitably follow. By late afternoon on November 9th, a recovery operation was underway. Investigators rappelled into the sinkhole using professional climbing equipment, carefully descending the stone walls while portable lights illuminated the scene below. Photographers documented everything, capturing images that would later be presented in court to demonstrate the callousness of whoever had thrown a child's body into this pit. Rowan was found wrapped in bedding, exactly as Christopher Collings had described in his confession. The fabric was damp from the cave's moisture, stained with decomposition and the elements. She had been exposed to near-freezing temperatures for 6 days, which had slowed but not stopped the natural processes of decay. The recovery team worked with painstaking care, treating Rowan with the dignity she had been denied in death. They lifted her remains gently, secured them in a body bag designed for forensic preservation, and raised her to the surface using a pulley system set up at the cave's entrance. Sheriff Chris Jennings was present during the recovery. He would later describe that moment, watching them bring Rowan out of the darkness, as one of the most difficult experiences of his 44-year law enforcement career. "I've worked homicides, accidents, suicides," Jennings said years later. "But there's something about a child victim that just tears at you in a different way. Knowing what was done to her, seeing where she ended up, it stays with you." Jennings had brought something with him to the recovery scene. Rowan's school identification card, the small plastic badge she would have worn on a lanyard at Triway Elementary. He had collected it as part of the initial investigation, one of many mundane items that take on profound meaning in a murder case. He would carry that ID card with him every day for the next 17 years. Once Rowan's body was recovered, it was transported to the medical examiner's office in Springfield, Missouri, where Dr. Keith Norton would conduct the autopsy. The examination would take place the following day, November 10th, 2007. Meanwhile, law enforcement had 2 confessed killers in custody and a community demanding answers. Christopher Collings and David Spears were both arrested on November 9, shortly after their confessions. They were initially held in the Newton County Jail, though they would later be separated and moved to different facilities to prevent any possibility of communication or collusion. The charges were as serious as Missouri law allows: first-degree murder, forcible rape of a child under 12, and kidnapping. All three charges carried the potential for the death penalty under Missouri's capital punishment statute, which specifically includes the murder of a child under 14 as an aggravating factor. But prosecutors faced an immediate problem that would define this case for years to come. Dr. Keith Norton had performed thousands of autopsies during his career as a forensic pathologist. He had examined victims of car accidents, industrial injuries, drug overdoses, suicides, and homicides. He had testified in countless trials, explaining to juries the clinical details of death in language non-medical professionals could understand. But examining the body of a 9-year-old murder victim is different. No amount of professional detachment fully shields you from the emotional reality of what you're documenting. The autopsy of Rowan Ford took place on November 10, 2007, approximately 1 week after her death. Dr. Norton's examination would provide the forensic foundation for every aspect of the case that followed, confirming how she died, documenting what was done to her, and collecting evidence that would either support or refute the confessions already given. The external examination revealed a small girl who should have been growing, playing, dreaming about her future. Rowan measured 4 feet, 6 inches tall, and weighed approximately 70 pounds average for a 9-year-old. Though on the smaller side, her brown hair, which teachers remembered as frequently matted and neglected, was now tangled further from the days spent at the bottom of Fox Cave. She was still wearing her pajamas, evidence supporting Collings' claim that he assaulted her in her bedroom, not after taking her somewhere else. The clothing was collected carefully, each piece bagged and labeled for forensic examination. The cause of death was ligature strangulation. Dr. Norton identified the telltale signs: petechiae in the eyes, tiny hemorrhages caused by asphyxiation damage to the structures of the neck, and patterns on the skin consistent with compression from a cord, rope, or similar object. Rowan had been strangled, her airway cut off until her brain was deprived of oxygen and her heart stopped. Death by strangulation is not instantaneous. It takes minutes long, terrifying minutes, during which the victim remains conscious, aware of what's happening, fighting for breath that won't come. For a 9-year-old child, those must have been minutes of incomprehensible terror. But strangulation wasn't the only violence inflicted on Rowan Ford. The internal examination revealed severe trauma to her genital area. Dr. Norton documented a 3/4 of an inch laceration to the vaginal wall, an injury consistent with forcible penetration, far beyond anything consensual or accidental. For a prepubescent child, this level of trauma would have been excruciatingly painful. The medical evidence left no doubt. Rowan Ford had been raped before she was murdered. Dr. Norton collected biological samples from the sexual assault swabs, hair, trace evidence, anything that might identify her attacker through DNA analysis. These samples would be sent to 3 separate laboratories for independent analysis, a level of redundancy rare in criminal cases, but critical given the seriousness of the charges and the potential for the death penalty. The autopsy also documented other findings relevant to understanding Rowan's final hours. Her stomach contents suggested she had eaten several hours before death, consistent with a dinner sometime Saturday evening before the assault. There were no defensive wounds on her hands or arms, suggesting she may have been unconscious or too small to effectively fight back against an adult attacker. Dr. Norton's final report, which would eventually be submitted to the court, painted a clear picture. Rowan Ford died from ligature strangulation after being sexually assaulted. The manner of death was homicide. The brutality of the crimes was beyond question. Now came the critical question: what did the forensic evidence say about who committed these crimes? The biological samples collected during the autopsy were sent to 3 facilities for DNA analysis: the FBI's laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Laboratory in Springfield, and an independent forensic lab contracted by the defense. All 3 labs followed standard protocols for DNA extraction, amplification, and comparison. They analyzed the samples against reference DNA collected from Christopher Collings, David Spears, and Rowan herself. The results from all 3 laboratories were consistent, and in some ways, unexpected. A partial DNA profile was developed from a hair found in Christopher Collings' pickup truck. The hair was consistent with Rowan's DNA at a frequency of 1 in 328,700 people. While not a perfect match, partial profiles never are. The statistical probability strongly suggested the hair belonged to Rowan. This finding corroborated Collings' confession that he had transported Rowan's body in his truck to Fox Cave. Additional forensic evidence linked Collings to the crime scene. Fibers, consistent with the bedding used to wrap Rowan's body, were found in his truck. Accelerant residue and ash consistent with burned fabric were found in a burn pit on the Ford property, supporting Collings' claim that he destroyed the mattress and clothing. Everything pointed to Christopher Collings as the perpetrator. But what about David Spears? The forensic findings regarding Spears were remarkable for what they didn't show: any connection to the sexual assault or murder. No DNA from David Spears was found on Rowan's body or clothing. No biological evidence from the rape matched Spears' genetic profile. No forensic link connected him to the bedroom where the assault occurred or to the method of strangulation. More significantly, the medical evidence actively excluded Spears as the perpetrator of the sexual assault. David Spears had undergone a vasectomy years before Rowan's death. While a vasectomy doesn't eliminate all traces of male biology from sexual fluids, it does alter the microscopic appearance and composition in ways that forensic examiners can identify. The biological evidence collected from Rowan's sexual assault was inconsistent with the perpetrator having had a vasectomy. This didn't just fail to link Spears to the rape, it actively excluded him. 3 separate laboratories, examining the evidence independently, reached the same conclusion. There was zero physical evidence implicating David Spears in the sexual assault or murder of Rowan Ford. Zero. This created an extraordinary situation. David Spears had confessed to participating in the rape and murder of his stepdaughter. He had provided details. He had expressed remorse. He had, by his own admission, played a role in these horrific crimes. But science contradicted his confession. The discrepancy between Spears' confession and the forensic evidence would become central to the legal proceedings that followed. It raised profound questions about why someone would confess to murders they didn't commit. It challenged assumptions about the reliability of confessions, and it would ultimately lead prosecutors to make a decision that satisfied no one. But there was one more piece of forensic evidence that complicated the picture even further: the cadaver dogs. During the investigation, law enforcement deployed canines trained to detect the scent of human remains. These dogs are remarkably accurate, capable of identifying death odors even after bodies have been removed and crime scenes cleaned. The cadaver dogs were brought to the Ford property and to the vehicles owned by the suspects. Their reactions would provide additional clues about where Rowan's body had been. The dogs alerted on David Spears' Chevrolet Suburban, indicating the presence of human remains or death odors in his vehicle. The dogs did not alert on Christopher Collings' pickup truck, despite the fact that Collings had confessed to transporting Rowan's body in that truck, and despite the presence of a hair matching her DNA profile. This contradiction, cadaver dogs alerting on the vehicle of the man the forensic evidence excluded, while not alerting on the vehicle of the man the forensic evidence implicated, defied easy explanation. Some investigators suggested the Suburban had been used to transport Rowan's body at some point, perhaps during the disposal, or in a scenario where both men were involved in ways that differed from either confession. Others argued the dogs could have been reacting to contamination or to other factors unrelated to Rowan's case. Defense attorneys would later seize on this contradiction, arguing it proved David Spears had some involvement that the confessions didn't fully capture. Prosecutors countered that the absence of forensic evidence in the Suburban proved the dog alert was a false positive or an irrelevant finding. Ultimately, the cadaver dog evidence remained an anomaly, a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit cleanly into any narrative. As the forensic examination concluded in late November 2007, investigators were left with a clear picture of what happened to Rowan Ford and a complicated picture of who was responsible. Christopher Collings' guilt was supported by overwhelming evidence. His confession, DNA findings, fiber evidence, and his knowledge of details only the killer would know. No reasonable doubt existed about his involvement. David Spears' guilt was supported only by his own confession, a confession contradicted by every piece of forensic evidence, yet detailed enough to be haunting. Had he been present? Had he enabled the crime? Had he been so intoxicated or traumatized that he falsely believed he participated? Or had he been coerced into confessing by psychological manipulation? Answering those questions required understanding who these two men were, what circumstances brought them to that house on that November night, what psychological and social factors made them capable of such evil, and what their relationship to each other revealed about the crime. Christopher Allen Collings was born in February 1975 in southwestern Missouri. From the beginning, his life was marked by instability, abandonment, and trauma circumstances that would later be offered, though never accepted as justification, for the monster he became. By the time Collings was 6 months old, both of his parents were incarcerated. The crimes that led to their imprisonment are not specified in the public record, but the result was clear. An infant entered the foster care system, severed from biological family, passed between temporary placements in the lottery of state custody. Foster care in rural Missouri during the 1970s and 80s varied wildly in quality. Some children found loving, stable homes. Others experienced neglect, abuse, or simple indifference. Christopher Collings fell into the latter category. Court documents and psychiatric evaluations conducted decades later paint a picture of a childhood defined by chaos. Collings was moved between multiple foster placements, never staying anywhere long enough to form secure attachments. The adults in his life changed constantly. New faces, new rules, new homes, each transition reinforcing the fundamental instability of his existence. And then came the sexual abuse. When Christopher Collings was approximately 6 years old, he was sexually assaulted by an adult in one of his foster placements. The abuse was documented but apparently not adequately addressed. Collings remained in the foster system, where, at age 15, he was sexually assaulted again, this time, records suggest, by another foster youth or possibly a caregiver. 2 documented sexual assaults during childhood. Likely more that went unreported or unrecognized. For a developing brain, particularly one already stressed by abandonment and instability, this level of trauma rewires fundamental psychological structures. Dr. Wanda Draper, a psychologist who would later evaluate Collings for his capital murder trial, diagnosed him with severe, disorganized, dissociative attachment disorder, a condition resulting from profound early trauma and the inability to form secure bonds with caregivers. Children with this disorder often struggle with emotional regulation, have difficulty understanding cause and effect in relationships, and can develop distorted views about intimacy, control, and violence. The diagnosis also included intermittent explosive disorder, a condition characterized by sudden, intense outbursts of anger or violence disproportionate to the situation. People with this disorder can seem calm and normal for extended periods, then explode into rage without apparent warning. These weren't excuses for what Collings would later do, but they were context evidence that the human capacity for evil often grows from seeds planted in childhood, watered by neglect and abuse, cultivated in environments where no one intervenes. By age 15 or 16, Collings' mental health had deteriorated to the point that psychiatric hospitalization became necessary. He spent time in a residential treatment facility, receiving medication and therapy for his behavioral and emotional problems. The treatments apparently helped enough that he was eventually released, but the underlying issues never fully resolved. As Collings entered adulthood, he struggled to establish stability. He moved frequently, worked inconsistent jobs, and formed relationships that rarely lasted. By 2007, at age 32, he was essentially transient, crashing on friends' couches, including the Spears-Munson household, moving wherever opportunity or obligation took him. But here's the striking thing. Christopher Collings had no adult criminal record before November 2007. No arrests for violence, no history of sexual offenses, no documented evidence that he posed a danger to children. To the people who knew him, including David Spears, Colleen Munson, and Rowan Ford, he was just Uncle Chris, a troubled guy who needed help getting back on his feet. Collings had 3 daughters living in Arkansas. He maintained some connection to them, though the details of his parenting are sparse in the public record. There's no indication he had abused his own children or that authorities had reason to be concerned about his contact with them. This is part of what makes the Rowan Ford case so chilling. The monster was hiding in plain sight, looking like just another down-on-his-luck friend in need of a place to stay. But the psychological damage from his childhood, the attachment disorder, the impulse control problems, the inability to empathize, created a person capable of sudden, extreme violence when the circumstances aligned. And on November 3, 2007, the circumstances aligned. David Spears represented a different kind of danger. Born in 1982, Spears grew up in Newton County, part of the rural working-class culture that defines much of southwestern Missouri. Unlike Collings, Spears didn't experience documented childhood trauma. His upbringing appeared, from outside, relatively normal. But normal is a relative term, and in communities where poverty, limited education, and substance abuse are common, dysfunction becomes normalized. By his mid-20s, David Spears was married to Colleen Munson, stepfather to her daughter Rowan, and working odd jobs to make ends meet. He had carpentry skills, which led to employment, with Mark Bridges doing construction and renovation work. He was known around Stella, not famous, not notorious, just another local guy trying to get by. His friendship with Christopher Collings went back approximately 10 years by 2007. They met in their teens or early 20s, bonding in the way young men in small towns do through shared circumstances, mutual acquaintances, and the kind of casual friendship that develops when your social circle is limited by geography. The relationship between Spears and Collings appeared to be one where Spears held the dominant personality. He was the one with the house, the marriage, the relative stability. Collings was the one crashing on the couch, dependent on Spears' generosity for a place to stay. But this dynamic also created power and obligation. Collings owed Spears. When you're living in someone's home, eating their food, accepted as part of their household, you become entangled in ways that complicate relationships and create unspoken debts. What David Spears knew or suspected about Christopher Collings' psychological problems is unclear. Did he know about the childhood sexual abuse, the psychiatric hospitalizations, the diagnoses of attachment and impulse control disorders? Or did he simply see his old friend as someone down on his luck who needed help? Either way, by allowing Collings to live in his home, Spears introduced a dangerous element into Rowan's life. Whether he understood the danger is a question that would later matter to investigators and prosecutors trying to determine his culpability. David Spears's behavior on the night of November 3, 2007, reveals a pattern of recklessness and poor judgment that, even if it didn't make him a murderer, certainly made him complicit in creating the conditions where murder became possible. He left his 9-year-old stepdaughter alone with Christopher Collings. Even if he trusted Collings completely, leaving a child alone in the care of a non-family member while both adults in the household were gone is questionable parenting at best. He was drinking heavily that evening, impaired enough that his later statements to police lacked clarity about timing and details. In rural Missouri, driving intoxicated is sadly common. But combining intoxication with abandoning your parental responsibilities elevates the recklessness. And then there's the 5.5-hour absence starting at 1:30 in the morning, an unexplained period that Spears never adequately accounted for. Where was he? What was he doing? Why did he leave? Why did he stay gone so long? Even after Rowan disappeared, Spears' behavior raised red flags. He waited hours to report her missing. He provided inconsistent statements to police. He eventually confessed to participating in her murder, despite the complete absence of evidence supporting that confession. So who was David Spears? Was he a murderer who got away with it because the forensic evidence failed to capture his involvement? Was he a guilty enabler who confessed to more than he did out of shame and trauma? Was he an innocent man, psychologically manipulated into a false confession? Or was he something in between, someone whose negligence and poor choices created the opportunity for Rowan's death, who perhaps participated in disposing of her body or covering up the crime, but who didn't actually rape and strangle her? This question would dominate the legal proceedings for years and would ultimately result in outcomes that satisfied almost no one. Understanding Christopher Collings and David Spears requires understanding their relationship, how two men with such different backgrounds became friends, what bound them together, and how that relationship factored into the events of November 3rd. Investigators interviewed numerous people who knew both men. The picture that emerged was of a codependent friendship where Collings relied on Spears for material support and Spears tolerated Collings' presence despite his instability. Friends described Collings as troubled and unpredictable. Some recalled incidents where he became inexplicably angry or withdrawn. Others remembered him as generally quiet, the kind of person who faded into the background at social gatherings. David Spears was described as more outgoing, though also prone to excessive drinking and poor decision-making. Multiple people noted that when Spears and Collings got together, they often drank heavily, sometimes using marijuana or other substances. The substance abuse is relevant because both men's confessions described being intoxicated on the night of the murder. Alcohol doesn't cause people to commit sexual assault and murder. Plenty of people drink heavily without becoming violent criminals. But alcohol does lower inhibitions, impair judgment, and make people capable of actions they might not consider while sober. For Christopher Collings, someone already struggling with impulse control and psychological damage, intoxication could have been the catalyst that turned dark impulses into action. For David Spears, someone whose judgment was already questionable, intoxication could explain the reckless decision to leave Rowan alone with Collings, and possibly the confusion and guilt that later led to a false confession. The relationship between the two men would also become relevant during the legal proceedings, as prosecutors and defense attorneys argued about who bore what responsibility. Was Collings a lone actor who took advantage of an opportunity? Was Spears a co-conspirator who participated more than the evidence showed? Did they plan the attack together? Or was it an impulsive act by one man that the other later helped cover up? The forensic evidence pointed clearly to Collings as the perpetrator of the sexual assault and murder. But evidence or its absence doesn't always tell the complete story, especially when human behavior involves lies, manipulation, and the complex dynamics of friendship and power. The arrests of Christopher Collings and David Spears on November 9, 2007, triggered a legal process that would ultimately span 17 years from initial charges to final execution. Newton County prosecutor Johnny Cox faced an unprecedented challenge. He had two suspects who both confessed to murdering Rowan Ford, but only one suspect whose guilt was supported by physical evidence. How do you prosecute a case when the defendant's own statements contradict each other and contradict the science? The initial charges filed against both men were identical: first-degree murder, forcible rape of a child under 12, and kidnapping. All three charges were filed with special circumstances that made them death penalty eligible under Missouri law. Missouri's capital punishment statute specifies certain aggravating factors that can justify a sentence of death rather than life imprisonment. Rowan's case involved multiple such factors. The victim was under age 14, the murder occurred during the commission of forcible rape, and the murder was outrageously or wantonly vile, horrible, or inhuman in its manner. If convicted, both Christopher Collings and David Spears faced execution. But as the evidence was reviewed in preparation for trial, the discrepancy between the forensic findings and David Spears' confession became impossible to ignore. Prosecutor Cox consulted with the FBI laboratory, the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab, and the Independent Forensic Facility. All three confirmed the same conclusion: there was no physical evidence linking David Spears to the sexual assault or murder. Cox was faced with a choice. He could proceed to trial against Spears, relying primarily on the confession and arguing that the absence of physical evidence didn't prove innocence. Juries have convicted defendants based on confessions, even when forensic evidence was minimal. But Cox also knew that defense attorneys would hammer the forensic findings, arguing that the evidence proved Spears' innocence and that his confession must have been coerced or false. The risk of losing at trial was significant, and if Spears were acquitted of murder, he might walk free entirely under double jeopardy protections. Alternatively, Cox could reduce the charges against Spears to reflect what the evidence actually proved: that he had endangered Rowan through neglect and had hindered the investigation by lying to police and destroying evidence. It took nearly 5 years for this decision to be made. Christopher Collings remained in custody, his trial date pushed back repeatedly due to pretrial motions, competency evaluations, and the sheer complexity of building a death penalty case. Meanwhile, David Spears also remained incarcerated, technically charged with murder but facing growing uncertainty about whether those charges would stand. On September 26, 2012, nearly 5 years after Rowan's death, prosecutor Johnny Cox made a stunning announcement. The murder and rape charges against David Spears were being dropped. In a public statement, Cox explained, "I don't know why Spears told law enforcement he was involved in Rowan's murder when evidence indicated he wasn't involved." The statement was remarkable for its candor. Prosecutors rarely admit uncertainty about confessions, especially in high-profile cases. But Cox was acknowledging what had become undeniable. David Spears had confessed to crimes he didn't commit, and proceeding with murder charges would be unjust given what the evidence actually showed. Instead, Spears pleaded guilty to 2 reduced charges: first-degree child endangerment and hindering prosecution. The child endangerment charge stemmed from Spears' decision to leave Rowan alone with Christopher Collings, and more broadly, from the pattern of neglect documented by teachers and investigators. By failing to protect his stepdaughter from a known danger or a danger he should have recognized, Spears had criminally endangered her welfare. The hindering prosecution charge addressed his lies to police, the delayed missing person report, and his possible participation in destroying evidence like the mattress from Rowan's bedroom. Under the plea agreement, David Spears was sentenced to 7 years for child endangerment and 4 years for hindering prosecution, with the sentences to run concurrently. Effectively, he received a 7-year sentence, a fraction of what a murder conviction would have brought, but more than a slap on the wrist. With credit for time already served since his November 2007 arrest, Spears was released from prison in March 2015, having served just over 7 years. The decision to drop the murder charges sparked outrage in the community and among Rowan's family members. Many people couldn't reconcile the fact that Spears confessed to murder but was convicted only of lesser charges. They felt justice had been denied, that Spears had gotten away with participation in Rowan's death. Sheriff Chris Jennings, who had carried Rowan's school ID since the investigation began, expressed frustration but acknowledged the prosecutorial dilemma. "I wanted both of them to face murder charges," Jennings said. "But I also understand that you can't convict someone when the science says they weren't there. It's a hard situation." The decision also raised profound questions about why David Spears had confessed. If he didn't rape and murder Rowan, why did he say he did? Several theories emerged. Coercion through relationship exploitation. Mark Bridges, the coroner who interrogated Spears, used their employer-employee relationship and his authority as a pastor to extract the confession. Defense attorneys later argued this constituted psychological manipulation. Bridges leveraged spiritual authority to convince Spears that confessing was the path to redemption, even if the confession wasn't true. Guilt and responsibility. Spears may have felt profoundly guilty for leaving Rowan alone with Collings, for failing to protect her, for enabling the circumstances that led to her death. In his intoxicated, traumatized state, he may have genuinely believed he bore responsibility equivalent to having committed the murder himself. Memory impairment. Spears admitted to heavy drinking that night and to being intoxicated during much of the evening. His 5.5-hour absence remained unexplained. It's possible he genuinely didn't remember what happened and, under aggressive interrogation, began to believe he must have participated. Partial involvement. Perhaps Spears was involved in ways the forensic evidence didn't capture, helping dispose of the body, cleaning the crime scene, acting as a lookout. His confession may have been an attempt to acknowledge that involvement without admitting to the sexual assault and murder specifically. Fear and intimidation. Interrogation techniques are designed to break down resistance and extract confessions. It's possible Spears felt cornered, believed lying was futile, and confessed simply to end the psychological pressure of sustained questioning. Whichever explanation is correct, and it may be a combination of several, David Spears' false confession highlights a disturbing reality. People confess to crimes they didn't commit more often than the public realizes. But for Rowan's family and the community of Stella, the nuances of false confessions and prosecutorial discretion mattered less than the bottom line. One of the men they believed killed Rowan was going to serve only 7 years. That left Christopher Collings. While David Spears' case resolved through plea agreement, Christopher Collings' capital murder trial became the focus of the justice system's response to Rowan's death. Collings was represented by public defenders from the Missouri State Public Defender's Office, which handles capital cases throughout Missouri. The trial was moved out of Newton County due to pre-trial publicity. Finding an impartial jury in a county where everyone knew about Rowan Ford would have been impossible. The case was transferred to Phelps County, approximately 140 miles northeast of where the crime occurred. Judge Mary Sheffield was assigned to preside over the trial. Collings pleaded not guilty despite his confessions to police. This is a common legal strategy in capital cases, even when guilt is clear. Defense attorneys focus on preventing the death penalty by presenting mitigating circumstances during the sentencing phase. The trial began on March 12, 2012, in the Phelps County Courthouse in Rolla, Missouri. Prosecutor Johnny Cox presented a methodical case built on multiple pillars of evidence. Collings videotaped confessions to Chief Clinton Clark and FBI investigators, the forensic findings linking him to the crime, the discovery of Rowan's body exactly where Collings said it would be, and testimony from law enforcement and medical experts. The confessions were particularly damning. The jury watched video of Christopher Collings describing what he did to Rowan, the sexual assault in her bedroom, the strangulation, the disposal of her body at Fox Cave. They heard him explain, in his own words, how he wrapped her in bedding, drove her to the sinkhole, and threw her into the darkness. They watched him cry. They watched him express remorse. They watched him claim he didn't fully understand why he did it. The forensic testimony reinforced the confessions. Dr. Keith Norton described the autopsy findings, the cause of death, the sexual trauma, the physical evidence of violence. FBI analysts explained the DNA match from the hair in Collings' truck. Crime scene technicians described the burn pit where the mattress and clothing were destroyed. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Christopher Allen Collings raped and murdered 9-year-old Rowan Ford. The defense didn't contest. Collings' guilt couldn't contest it, really, given the overwhelming evidence. Instead, defense attorneys focused on mental health mitigation, attempting to explain, not excuse, how someone becomes capable of such evil. Dr. Wanda Draper testified as an expert witness for the defense. She explained Collings' childhood trauma in clinical terms: the abandonment by incarcerated parents, the instability of foster care, the documented sexual abuse at ages 6 and 15, the failure of the system to provide adequate mental health intervention. She described his diagnoses: severe disorganized dissociative attachment disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, and the psychological damage resulting from profound early trauma. Mr. Collings' brain didn't develop normally, Dr. Draper testified. The structures responsible for impulse control, empathy, and understanding consequences were damaged during critical developmental periods. This doesn't make him not responsible for his actions, but it does explain how someone becomes capable of them. The defense presented evidence of Collings' psychiatric hospitalization as a teenager, his struggles with mental health throughout his adult life, and his lack of any prior adult criminal record. They argued that he was not a predatory monster who planned to hurt Rowan, but rather someone whose damaged brain produced a catastrophic loss of control under specific circumstances: intoxication, stress, opportunity. They asked the jury to consider life imprisonment without the possibility of parole rather than death. The trial lasted 8 days. The jury heard from dozens of witnesses, reviewed hundreds of pieces of evidence, and deliberated for approximately 6 hours before reaching a verdict. On March 20, 2012, Christopher Allen Collings was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, forcible rape of a child under 12, and kidnapping. 3 days later, on March 23, the same jury began the sentencing phase, the portion of a capital trial where they decide between life imprisonment and execution. In Missouri, the death penalty requires the jury to unanimously find specific aggravating circumstances and to conclude that those circumstances outweigh any mitigating factors. The burden is high, as it should be, when the state seeks to take a life. The prosecution argued that Rowan's murder met every criterion for the ultimate punishment. She was a child, vulnerable, innocent, dependent on adults for protection. She was raped, subjected to unimaginable pain and violation. She was murdered to cover up that rape. And the manner of her death, strangled, disposed of in a sinkhole, treated like garbage, was outrageously and wantonly vile, horrible, and inhumane. The defense continued their mitigation presentation, adding new witnesses who described Collings' capacity for kindness, his relationships with his daughters, and the psychological damage that shaped his ability to make moral choices. The jury deliberated for 48 minutes. Then they returned with their decision. Christopher Allen Collings would be sentenced to death. The brevity of the deliberation, less than an hour, suggested the jury found the aggravating circumstances so overwhelming that extensive debate wasn't necessary. For many people in the courtroom, including Sheriff Chris Jennings and members of Rowan's family, the sentence felt like justice. But capital punishment is never truly final when it's imposed. What follows is years, often decades, of appeals. Christopher Collings' execution was scheduled, theoretically, within months of his March 2012 sentencing. But in practice, no one expected it to occur soon. Capital cases in Missouri, like those in all death penalty states, trigger an automatic appeals process designed to ensure that no person is executed without exhaustive review. Collings' appeals would take 12 more years. The first level of appeal went to the Missouri Supreme Court, which reviews all death penalty convictions under state law. Collings' attorneys argued multiple grounds for overturning his conviction or sentence. Ineffective assistance of counsel. The defense argued that Collings' trial attorneys failed to adequately present mental health mitigation evidence, didn't sufficiently challenge the admissibility of his confessions, and made strategic errors that prejudiced his right to a fair trial. Involuntary confession. The defense contended that Chief Clinton Clark exploited his 17-year personal friendship with Collings to extract a confession that wasn't truly voluntary. They argued this violated Collings' constitutional rights against self-incrimination. Prosecutorial misconduct. The defense pointed to various alleged improprieties during trial, including inflammatory statements and evidence presentation that supposedly prejudiced the jury. Disproportionate sentence. The defense argued that even if Collings was guilty, the death penalty was disproportionate given his lack of prior criminal record and significant mental health issues. On appeal, the Missouri Supreme Court rejected every argument. In a decision issued in 2014, the court upheld both the conviction and the death sentence. The court found that the confession was voluntary. While Clark and Collings had a personal relationship, there was no evidence of physical coercion, threats, or promises that would render the confession inadmissible. Collings had been read his Miranda rights, understood them, and chose to speak. The court found that trial counsel's performance met constitutional standards. While different strategic choices might have been made, the defense didn't prove that their attorney's representation fell below the threshold of competence required by law. The court found the death sentence proportionate to the crime. Given the aggravating circumstances, a child victim, rape, and the manner of death, the sentence was consistent with Missouri's application of capital punishment in similar cases. Collings' direct appeal to the Missouri Supreme Court failed. Next came state post-conviction relief proceedings, a separate legal mechanism allowing prisoners to raise constitutional claims not addressed during trial or direct appeal. These proceedings stretched over several more years, with extensive briefing and evidentiary hearings. The post-conviction claims largely mirrored the direct appeal issues. Ineffective assistance of counsel, constitutional violations during interrogation, and challenges to the reliability of the evidence. Collings' attorneys also raised new claims based on subsequently discovered evidence or legal developments in other cases. In 2018, the Missouri Supreme Court again denied relief, finding no merit in the post-conviction claims. With state remedies exhausted, the case moved to federal court. Federal habeas corpus petitions allow state prisoners to challenge their convictions and sentences on constitutional grounds in federal court. This is the final safety net in the American legal system, a chance for federal judges to independently review whether constitutional rights were violated. Collings filed his federal habeas petition in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Missouri. The petition raised dozens of claims, arguing that his trial violated the Fourth Amendment regarding search and seizure, the Fifth Amendment regarding self-incrimination, the Sixth Amendment regarding right to counsel, the Eighth Amendment regarding cruel and unusual punishment, and the 14th Amendment regarding due process. Federal habeas review is deferential to state court findings. Federal judges generally won't overturn a state conviction unless the state courts made objectively unreasonable decisions on constitutional questions. This deference makes federal habeas relief difficult to obtain. In 2022, the federal district court denied Collings' habeas petition. The court found that the Missouri Supreme Court had reasonably applied federal constitutional law and that none of Collings' claims warranted relief. Collings appealed to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, which reviews habeas decisions from district courts in several Midwestern states. The Eighth Circuit issued a ruling in late 2023, affirming the district court's denial of relief. That left only one option: the United States Supreme Court. Collings' attorneys filed a petition for a writ of certiorari, essentially asking the Supreme Court to agree to hear the case. The Supreme Court receives thousands of these petitions each year and accepts only a tiny fraction, typically those involving novel constitutional questions or conflicts between different appellate courts. On April 1, 2024, the Supreme Court denied certiorari. The decision meant the court saw no constitutional issues warranting its review. Christopher Collings had exhausted his appeals. The road to execution was now clear, unless Governor Michael Parson exercised his clemency power to commute the sentence to life imprisonment. Clemency is the final safeguard in capital cases, the recognition that despite extensive legal review, circumstances sometimes warrant mercy. Missouri governors, like executives in other death penalty states, have the constitutional authority to commute sentences or grant pardons. Clemency petitions are different from appeals. They don't argue legal errors or constitutional violations. Instead, they present moral, factual, or equitable reasons why execution shouldn't proceed. Collings' legal team, led by attorney Jeremy Weiss, filed a comprehensive clemency petition with Governor Parson in late 2024. The petition emphasized several key points: brain abnormalities. Neurological testing conducted during the appeals process revealed structural abnormalities in Collings' brain consistent with his history of trauma and documented mental health conditions. The petition argued these abnormalities impaired his capacity for impulse control and moral reasoning. Childhood trauma. The petition detailed Collings' horrific upbringing: parental abandonment, foster care instability, sexual abuse, and the complete failure of systems designed to protect vulnerable children. It argued that society bore some responsibility for creating the damaged person who committed this crime. Remorse and rehabilitation. The petition included statements from Collings expressing genuine remorse for what he did to Rowan. It argued he had spent 17 years in prison, reflecting on his actions, and that continuing his imprisonment without execution would still serve justice. Juror reconsideration. Perhaps most compellingly, the petition revealed that 3 jurors from Collings' trial had come forward in the years since sentencing to say they no longer believed death was appropriate. These jurors stated that if they knew then what they knew now about his mental health and childhood trauma, they would have voted for life imprisonment without parole. Having jurors reconsider their own death sentence recommendation is extraordinarily unusual and carries significant moral weight. These weren't activists or appeals attorneys arguing against execution. These were the same citizens who sat through the trial, heard all the evidence, and originally imposed the death penalty. their change of heart suggested the sentence might not truly represent community judgment after full consideration. The clemency petition was supported by letters from mental health professionals, religious leaders, anti-death penalty advocates, and even some members of law enforcement who had worked the case but questioned whether execution was necessary. Governor Michael Parson, a Republican who had consistently supported capital punishment during his tenure, received the petition and considered it along with input from prosecutors, victim advocates, and his legal advisors. On December 2, 2024, one day before the scheduled execution, Governor Parson denied clemency. In his statement, Parson acknowledged Collings' difficult childhood but emphasized the heinous nature of his crimes and the devastating impact on Rowan's family and community. The jury heard the evidence and made their decision, Parson said. Justice requires that this sentence be carried out. The denial meant Christopher Collings would be executed the following evening unless an emergency legal intervention occurred. Defense attorneys filed last-minute appeals to the Missouri Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that new evidence of brain abnormalities and the jurors' reconsideration warranted a stay of execution pending further review. Both courts denied the requests. On December 3, 2024, 17 years and 1 month after Rowan Ford was murdered, Christopher Allen Collings would face execution. The Bonne Terre Correctional Center, located approximately 60 miles south of St. Louis, houses Missouri's execution chamber. The facility is a hulking structure of brick and concrete, built in the early 20th century and expanded over decades to accommodate Missouri's prison population. Somewhere within its walls, in a carefully controlled and deliberately unremarkable room, the state carries out court-ordered executions. On December 3, 2024, Christopher Allen Collings was transferred from death row housing to a holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber. He spent his final hours in a stark environment designed to prevent suicide or self-harm while offering minimal comfort. He was permitted final visits with his attorneys and spiritual advisors. He declined requests for media interviews, choosing not to make any public statement beyond what he would say in the execution chamber itself. His final meal, a tradition in many death penalty states, though one increasingly questioned as appropriate, consisted of a bacon cheeseburger, mushrooms, tater tots, and a chef salad. The meal was prepared by prison staff and served in his cell sometime in the afternoon. The choice of food was unremarkable, which itself is remarkable. You might expect someone facing death in hours to choose something exotic or expensive, but death row final meals typically reflect comfort rather than extravagance. Collings chose familiar, simple foods, perhaps a small psychological comfort in the face of what was coming. At approximately 5:45 in the evening, execution protocol began. Collings was escorted from his holding cell to the execution chamber by a team of correctional officers trained in the specific procedures required by Missouri law and federal constitutional standards. He was dressed in prison-issued clothing, his hands cuffed in front of him, his movements carefully monitored. The execution chamber is divided into two spaces: the room where the prisoner is lethally injected, and a separate witness room where selected individuals watch through glass windows. Missouri law allows victim family members, representatives from law enforcement, media witnesses, defense attorneys, and spiritual advisors to observe executions. For Rowan's execution, 14 witnesses were present. Sheriff Chris Jennings attended, carrying Rowan's school identification card in his pocket as he had every day for 17 years. 2 representatives from Rowan's family were there, their identities protected from public disclosure, but their presence documented in official records. Jeremy Weiss, Collings' attorney, attended as required by his ethical obligations to his client. Several media representatives were present, as allowed under Missouri protocol, and at least one spiritual advisor was there, present to offer whatever comfort religion provides to someone about to die. Christopher Collings was led into the execution chamber at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening. The room contains a gurney, essentially a hospital bed, with straps to secure the condemned person's arms, legs, and torso. Medical equipment lines the walls, though the personnel operating it are not physicians. The American Medical Association prohibits doctors from participating in executions, so states rely on trained technicians. Collings was instructed to lie on the gurney. He complied. Correctional officers secured the straps across his body, ensuring he couldn't move. Intravenous lines were inserted into veins in both arms, a redundancy to ensure the execution could proceed even if one line failed. The IV lines connected to machines in an adjacent room where the execution team prepared the drugs. Missouri, like many death penalty states, uses a 3-drug protocol, an anesthetic to render the person unconscious, a paralytic to stop breathing, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. The protocol is designed to be humane. The person feels nothing after the first drug takes effect. But the process has been controversial, with reports from botched executions in other states suggesting the drug cocktail doesn't always work as intended. Once Collings was secured and the IV lines tested, he was asked if he had any final words. In Missouri, final statements are allowed, but not required. Some condemned prisoners deliver lengthy speeches. Others say nothing. Some proclaim their innocence. Others express remorse. Christopher Collings chose to speak. According to witnesses present, Collings addressed the family representatives visible through the glass. "I accept responsibility for what I did," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I am truly sorry for the pain I caused. I hope one day to see you all in heaven, where we can understand these things better than we do now." The statement was brief, perhaps 30 seconds, possibly less. It acknowledged guilt, expressed remorse, and invoked religious hope for reconciliation. Whether it provided any comfort to Rowan's family members is unknowable from outside their experience. At 6:01 in the evening, the execution began. The first drug, pentobarbital, a powerful barbiturate, flowed through the IV lines into Collings' bloodstream. Within seconds, the drug reached his brain, depressing the central nervous system and inducing unconsciousness. Witnesses reported that Collings' eyes closed, his body relaxed, and his breathing slowed. Medical personnel monitored his vital signs through equipment visible only to them. After confirming unconsciousness, the second drug was administered, a paralytic that stopped all voluntary muscle movement, including breathing. Finally, potassium chloride was injected. This drug disrupts the electrical signals that regulate the heartbeat, inducing cardiac arrest. The heart spasms, then stops. At 6:10 in the evening, 9 minutes after the execution began, medical personnel confirmed that Christopher Allen Collings' heart had stopped and he had no pulse. He was pronounced dead at 6:10 p.m. on December 3, 2024. The witnesses were escorted from the observation area. Collings' body remained on the gurney while medical personnel disconnected the IV lines and prepared it for transfer to the coroner. His remains would eventually be released to family or, if unclaimed, handled according to state procedures for deceased prisoners. Outside the Bonneterre facility, two groups gathered. Approximately 44 protesters held a vigil, opposing the death penalty on moral, religious, or practical grounds. They carried signs, prayed together, and bore witness to what they considered state-sanctioned killing rather than justice. Some protesters opposed capital punishment categorically. Others felt Collings' particular circumstances, his mental health issues, and childhood trauma made execution inappropriate, even if execution can sometimes be justified. No counter-protesters were documented. The execution proceeded without violence or disruption. In Stella, Missouri, more than 300 miles away, another vigil took place at the cemetery where Rowan Ford is buried. Community members gathered around her grave, lighting candles and offering prayers. For them, the execution represented a form of closure, though the pain of losing Rowan would never fully heal. Following the execution, several key figures issued statements. Sheriff Chris Jennings told reporters, "Christopher Collings went far more peacefully than his victim did. Rowan suffered. She was terrified. She died in pain. He died with medical care and people present. That's not equal, but it's what our system provides. Justice has been done, but it's only partial justice." Jennings added, "I will continue to carry Rowan's ID with me. She deserves to be remembered for who she was, not just what was done to her." Jeremy Weiss, Collings' attorney, expressed grief and frustration. "The execution of Christopher Collings is an act of vengeance, not justice. A man shaped by unimaginable childhood trauma with documented brain abnormalities has been killed by the state. This doesn't bring Rowan back. It doesn't heal her family. It just adds another death to the tragedy." Governor Parson released a brief statement. "Justice has been done for Rowan Ford and her family. Missouri will always stand with victims of crime." Reaction from the broader community varied. Some residents of Newton County expressed satisfaction that Collings had been executed, feeling it was the appropriate consequence for his crimes. Others questioned whether execution achieved anything beyond revenge, particularly given the 17 years that elapsed between crime and punishment. Media coverage focused on the unusual aspects of the case: the false confession by David Spears, the jurors who reconsidered their death sentence, the childhood trauma that shaped Collings' psychological development. National news outlets picked up the story, using it as a lens to examine broader questions about capital punishment, false confessions, and how childhood trauma intersects with criminal justice. Christopher Collings became the 23rd person executed in the United States in 2024, a year that saw continued decline in both death sentences imposed and executions carried out nationwide. He was the fourth person executed in Missouri that year, continuing the state's consistent application of capital punishment, despite declining use in many other states. With Collings' execution, one chapter of the Rowan Ford case closed, but others remained open. While Christopher Collings' path led from conviction to execution, David Spears' story took a turn that would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. After his March 2015 release from prison, having served just over 7 years for child endangerment and hindering prosecution, David Spears faced the challenge that confronts all ex-convicts: rebuilding a life with a criminal record. Finding employment with a felony conviction is difficult under the best circumstances. For someone whose name was nationally associated with one of Missouri's most notorious child murder cases, even though he'd been cleared of the murder itself, the challenge was exponentially greater. Spears moved through various jobs, struggling to establish stability. He remained on probation, subject to regular check-ins with a probation officer, drug testing, and the restrictions that come with supervised release. Then, in June 2016, something extraordinary happened. David Spears was hired by the Missouri State Public Defender's Office. Let that sink in for a moment. The same office that was representing Christopher Collings in his death penalty appeals, arguing that Collings should not be executed, that his childhood trauma and mental health issues warranted mercy, hired the man who had confessed to participating in the same murder for which Collings sat on death row. The hiring wasn't for a legal position. Spears worked as support staff, handling administrative or maintenance duties. But the optics were staggering. How did this happen? The circumstances surrounding Spears' hiring revealed layers of controversy that would eventually threaten the public defender's office's entire budget. Spears was hired by the husband of his former trial attorney, a public defender who had represented him during the plea negotiations that resulted in his reduced charges. This created an obvious conflict of interest, and the appearance, at minimum, of inappropriate favoritism. More troubling, Spears was hired, while still on probation, for crimes directly related to Rowan Ford's death. The Public Defender's Office, entrusted with representing indigent defendants throughout Missouri's criminal justice system, employed someone who had criminally endangered a child and hindered the investigation into her murder. And most controversially, this hiring occurred while the same office was simultaneously representing Christopher Collings in his capital appeals, arguing for his life to be spared. The contradiction was impossible to reconcile. How could the Public Defender's Office argue that Christopher Collings deserved mercy and life imprisonment while employing the other man who confessed to the same crime? How could they claim Collings' childhood trauma and mental health issues should mitigate his punishment while giving a paycheck to David Spears, whose negligence and obstruction enabled that crime? For years, the arrangement flew under the radar. Spears worked quietly. Few people outside the office knew of his employment, and the contradiction remained hidden from public scrutiny. Then it exploded. In late 2024, as Christopher Collings' execution date approached and media attention focused on the case, reporters uncovered David Spears' employment with the Public Defender's Office. The revelation sparked immediate outrage. Rowan's family members expressed betrayal and anger. Sheriff Chris Jennings called it unconscionable. Victims' rights advocates demanded explanations. Missouri legislators, who control the Public Defender's Office's budget through the state's appropriations process, were furious. During legislative hearings in early 2025, lawmakers from both parties grilled public defender administrators about how such a hiring could have occurred and why it had been allowed to continue for nearly 9 years. The Public Defender's Office attempted to justify the decision. They argued that Spears had a right to employment after serving his sentence, that he had been cleared of murder charges, and that his work was unrelated to legal representation or client cases. Legislators weren't persuaded. They pointed out the massive conflict of interest. How could the office credibly represent Collings when it employed Spears? They questioned the judgment of leadership that approved the hiring. They demanded accountability. The political pressure became insurmountable. The Public Defender's Office's annual budget of approximately $87 million was threatened. Legislators made clear that funding would be in jeopardy if the situation wasn't resolved. In February 2025, just weeks after Christopher Collings' execution, David Spears was terminated from his position with the Missouri State Public Defender's Office. The official statement cited concerns about public perception and the office's ability to effectively fulfill its mission. Reading between the lines, the message was clear. Political and public pressure had forced the termination of an employment arrangement that never should have existed in the first place. The Spears employment controversy highlighted several systemic issues beyond the specific facts of his case. First, it raised questions about re-entry and employment for ex-convicts. Society demands that people who've served their time be allowed to reintegrate, to find work, to rebuild their lives. Denying employment opportunities creates a cycle of recidivism where people return to crime because legitimate paths are blocked. But those re-entry principles collide with common sense when applied to specific circumstances. Should someone convicted of child endangerment work for an office responsible for protecting defendants' rights, including child defendants? Should someone who hindered a murder investigation work in any capacity related to the justice system? The law says Spears served his sentence and deserved a chance at employment. Public sentiment said this particular employment was inappropriate regardless of legal rights. Second, the controversy exposed how conflicts of interest can hide in plain sight when personal relationships influence hiring decisions. The fact that Spears was hired by his former attorney's husband created an undeniable appearance of impropriety, even if no actual favoritism influenced his job performance. Third, it demonstrated how institutions can make decisions that seem defensible in isolation but become indefensible when examined in full context. Hiring an ex-convict for a second chance? Commendable. Hiring this specific ex-convict while representing his co-defendant in a capital case? Incomprehensible. The termination of David Spears' employment didn't resolve the underlying questions about his role in Rowan Ford's death. He confessed to murder but was convicted only of lesser crimes. The forensic evidence supported his claim of non-involvement in the actual killing, but questions remained about what he knew, what he did, and why he lied. The 5.5-hour absence starting at 1:30 in the morning on November 4, 2007, was never explained. Where was David Spears during those critical hours? Was he truly gone from the house when Christopher Collings committed the crimes, or was he there, and the forensic evidence simply failed to capture his presence? The cadaver dogs alerting on Spears' Suburban but not on Collings' truck suggested something the confessions and forensic evidence didn't fully explain. Was Rowan's body transported in Spears' vehicle at some point? Did he help dispose of her body in ways that left no traceable forensic evidence? The delayed missing person report, 8 to 10 hours after Rowan's absence was discovered, remains suspicious. Did Spears and Collings spend those hours constructing a story, cleaning evidence, trying to figure out what to do? Or was the delay simply the dysfunction of a chaotic household responding poorly to crisis? These questions will likely never be answered definitively. David Spears has not spoken publicly about the case since his plea agreement. He didn't testify at Christopher Collings' trial. He hasn't granted media interviews or provided further explanation of what happened that night. He served his 7 years, was released, worked controversial employment for nearly 9 years, and was fired when that employment became politically untenable. For Rowan's family, the lack of full accountability for David Spears remains a source of pain and frustration. They believe he participated in Rowan's death more than the charges reflected. They feel justice was incomplete when he walked free while Christopher Collings was executed. For prosecutors, the Spears case represents the frustrating reality that what you can prove in court doesn't always match what you believe happened. Johnny Cox made the difficult but arguably correct decision to reduce the charges rather than risk an acquittal that would leave Spears free entirely. For the legal system, David Spears' false confession serves as a cautionary tale about interrogation techniques, psychological manipulation, and the reliability of admissions obtained through relationship exploitation. And for the public, the employment controversy illustrated how even well-intentioned policies, like giving ex-convicts employment opportunities, can produce outcomes that offend basic sensibilities when applied without sufficient consideration of context. David Spears today lives somewhere in Missouri, his exact location not publicly disclosed. He's no longer on probation, having completed his supervised release. He's no longer employed by the state. He's no longer a public figure in the way he was during the investigation and trial. But for those who remember Rowan Ford, David Spears remains a man who left a 9-year-old girl alone with a dangerous person, who waited hours to report her missing, who confessed to murder he may or may not have committed, who served just 7 years for enabling her death, and who was controversially employed by the office, defending the man convicted of killing her. Whether that's fair or accurate, it's the legacy he carries. Rowan Ford's funeral took place on November 14, 2007, at the Gospel Lighthouse Church in Stella, Missouri. More than 300 people attended, an enormous turnout for a community where fewer than 200 people lived. The service celebrated Rowan's short life, focusing on her brightness, her love of purple, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Photographs showed her smiling, playing, being the child she should have remained. Pastor after pastor spoke about innocence stolen, about the responsibility of communities to protect their most vulnerable members, about the theological challenge of making sense of such evil. Rowan was buried in a cemetery just outside Stella, her grave marked by a headstone that listed her birth and death, dates a span of only 9 years, 6 months, and 23 days. In the years that followed, the community established several memorials to ensure Rowan wouldn't be forgotten. Triway Elementary School planted a pink dogwood tree in Rowan's memory on the school grounds. Each spring, when the tree bloomed, students learned about their classmate, who never got to finish 4th grade. Teachers organized purple ribbon campaigns and memorial events, keeping Rowan's story alive for children who never knew her. Todd Holt, Rowan's teacher, kept her desk in his classroom untouched for days after her death, unable to pack away her school supplies and artwork. Years later, he would describe Rowan as the student who changed how I think about my responsibility to protect children, not just educate them. On what would have been Rowan's high school graduation day sometime in 2016, when she would have turned 18, Triway Elementary held a special ceremony. An empty chair was set up on the school's stage, draped with a purple ribbon. A diploma was printed with Rowan's name, acknowledging the education she never got to complete. Students released purple balloons into the Missouri sky, watching them drift away like the dreams Rowan never got to chase. On April 11, 2025, what would have been Rowan's 27th birthday, a permanent memorial bench was dedicated at the cemetery where she's buried. The marble bench is engraved with her name, dates, and a simple message, "Forever 9, forever loved." These memorials serve multiple purposes. They honor Rowan specifically, ensuring her brief life isn't reduced to just the manner of her death. They remind the community of its obligation to protect children, and they provide physical spaces where grief can be expressed and processed over time. But for those closest to Rowan, no memorial could fill the absence she left behind. Tyler, Rowan's best friend from 4th grade, struggled profoundly with the trauma. As a 9-year-old, Tyler couldn't fully comprehend what had happened, only that the friend who sat next to him at lunch, who shared playground games and whispered secrets, was suddenly gone. For months after Rowan's death, Tyler couldn't sleep alone in his room. He experienced nightmares, anxiety, and a pervasive sense that the world wasn't safe. His family sought counseling, but childhood trauma doesn't resolve quickly. Even years later, Tyler's family reported that he struggled with trust and with processing the randomness of violence. Tyler's family established a small tradition. Each Christmas, they purchase an ornament in Rowan's memory and hang it on their tree. It's a way of keeping her present in their lives, of acknowledging that friendship transcends death. Ariane, Rowan's older sister, was in her early 20s when Rowan was murdered. In 2024, at age 35, Ariane spoke publicly about losing her ray of sunshine. "Rowan was this bright spot in our family," Ariane said in one interview. "No matter what was happening, she found ways to be happy. She believed things would get better. She was the kind of kid who made you want to be better yourself." Losing Rowan fundamentally changed Ariane's relationship with the world. She described feeling anger at the systems that failed to protect her sister, the child protective services that addressed symptoms without investigating causes, the adults who saw warning signs but didn't intervene, the broader social structures that allow children to suffer in plain sight. "We talk about protecting children in the abstract," Ariane reflected. "But when it's your actual sister, when you see how many people could have done something and didn't, you realize how much those words don't translate into action." Ariane has become an advocate for strengthening child protective systems, speaking at community events about recognizing signs of neglect and abuse. Her activism is both a tribute to Rowan and an attempt to ensure other children don't suffer similar fates. The impact on Colleen Munson, Rowan's mother, was catastrophic. Losing a child is universally recognized as one of the most devastating experiences a person can endure. Losing a child to murder compounds that grief with trauma, guilt, and the impossibility of making sense of senseless violence. Colleen required psychiatric hospitalization in the months following Rowan's death. She struggled with severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Friends and family described her as becoming a shell of who she was, the vibrant person she had been before November 2007 faded, replaced by someone just trying to survive each day. Colleen also faced judgment from the community. Some people blamed her for working the night shift, for leaving Rowan and David Spears' care, for not recognizing the danger Christopher Collings posed. The judgment was often unfair. Hindsight bias makes dangers seem obvious after tragedy strikes that weren't obvious in real time, but it compounded her suffering. In the years since Rowan's death, Colleen has largely withdrawn from public life. She doesn't grant interviews or speak at memorial events. Her grief remains private, processed away from cameras and reporters. The community of Stella itself was transformed by Rowan's murder. Before November 2007, Stella was the kind of place where people felt safe. Crime was minimal. Children played outside without supervision. Doors were left unlocked. The biggest threats were economic poverty, limited opportunities, not violence. Rowan's murder shattered that sense of security. Parents became more cautious about who they allowed around their children. Background checks became common for babysitters and caregivers. Teachers received additional training in recognizing signs of abuse and neglect. Law enforcement increased patrols and community engagement. Sheriff Chris Jennings described the case as fundamentally changing Newton County's approach to child welfare investigations. Before Rowan, we might have responded to a lice report and considered it handled, Jennings said. Now we dig deeper. We ask harder questions. We look for patterns. We assume that visible symptoms might indicate hidden problems. The Newton County Sheriff's Department implemented new protocols for child endangerment investigations, requiring multiple follow-up visits and coordination with social services rather than treating each incident in isolation. Child Protective Services in Missouri also reevaluated their procedures, though systemic change is slow and uneven. The fundamental problem remains. Social workers are overloaded, underfunded, and forced to make impossible triage decisions about which cases require immediate intervention. Rowan's case highlighted these failures, but fixing them requires resources and political will that have been inconsistent. 17 years after Rowan Ford's murder, after trials and appeals and an execution, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Where was David Spears during the 5.5 hours he was gone from the house? He left around 1:30 in the morning and returned around 7. Where did he go? What did he do? Why has he never provided a credible explanation? This absence coincides with the critical period when Rowan was killed and her body was disposed of. Was Spears truly gone, leaving Christopher Collings alone to commit the crimes? Or was he present in some capacity that the forensic evidence failed to capture? The lack of explanation fuels speculation. Some believe Spears was at a bar, too intoxicated to remember details. Others think he was with another person, perhaps engaging in illegal activity he doesn't want to admit. Still, others suspect he was involved in Rowan's death, and his absence is a fabricated alibi. Without Spears speaking publicly, without additional evidence, the question remains open. Why did the cadaver dogs alert on David Spears' Suburban, but not on Christopher Collings' truck? This contradiction has never been satisfactorily explained. Collings confessed to transporting Rowan's body in his truck. DNA evidence confirmed a hair matching Rowan's profile was found in that truck. But the trained cadaver dogs didn't alert when they examined it. Meanwhile, the dogs did alert on Spears' Suburban, suggesting the presence of human remains or death odors. But no forensic evidence linked that vehicle to Rowan's body. Possible explanations include: the dogs had a false positive on the Suburban, perhaps reacting to contamination or other factors. Rowan's body was transported in both vehicles at different times. The truck was cleaned more thoroughly than the Suburban, eliminating odors the dogs would detect, or the dog's reliability in this case was questionable. None of these explanations is entirely satisfying, leaving the contradiction as one of many puzzling aspects of the case. What does the computer activity between 1:54 and 3:36 in the morning tell us? Forensic examination of computers in the Ford household revealed activity. During those hours, someone was using a computer for nearly 2 hours during the time Rowan was being murdered. Was this David Spears, providing a potential alibi for his whereabouts? Was it Christopher Collings, taking a break between committing the crimes? Was it someone else entirely? The content of the computer activity wasn't disclosed publicly, leaving its significance unclear. Was someone researching how to dispose of a body? Playing games as a way to cope with trauma? Looking at completely unrelated content, this small detail suggests there's more to the timeline than either confession revealed. Did Christopher Collings act completely alone? The forensic evidence points conclusively to Collings as the perpetrator of the sexual assault and murder. But did he conceive and execute these crimes entirely by himself? Some investigators believe David Spears had more involvement than the evidence proves, that he may have encouraged Collings, helped plan the crime, or assisted in the cover-up in ways that left no forensic trace. Others think Collings truly acted alone, that his decision to assault and kill Rowan was impulsive, driven by his psychological damage and the specific circumstances of that night: intoxication, opportunity, and the catastrophic failure of impulse control. The question matters not just for historical accuracy but for understanding how such crimes happen and how to prevent them. Could Rowan have been saved? This is perhaps the most painful question. Multiple adults saw warning signs that Rowan was being neglected. Teachers documented matted hair, lice infestations, missing socks in winter, and early arrivals to school suggesting she wanted to escape her home environment. Child Protective Services received hotline calls about these issues, but the responses were superficial: treat the lice, address the immediate symptom, move on to the next case. No one dug deeper. No one asked whether these symptoms indicated more serious problems at home. No one connected the dots to see a pattern of neglect that placed Rowan at risk. If someone had investigated more thoroughly, if the system had responded differently, could Rowan have been removed from the home before Christopher Collings murdered her? We can't know for certain. But the probability that more aggressive intervention could have saved her life is significant. That possibility that Rowan could have been saved if the systems designed to protect children had worked properly haunts everyone involved in the case. Sheriff Chris Jennings has stated repeatedly, "The system let Rowan down. We all let Rowan down." Why did Rowan's case receive so much attention while other similar cases fade into obscurity? This question isn't specific to Rowan's murder, but reflects broader patterns in how society responds to crime. Rowan was young, white, from a rural community that fits certain narratives about small-town innocence. Her case involved dramatic elements, 2 confessions, forensic contradictions, eventual execution that sustained media interest. Other child murder cases, particularly those involving minority victims or occurring in urban areas, receive far less coverage. The disparity in attention reflects uncomfortable truths about which victims society deems worthy of prolonged outrage and which are quickly forgotten. Rowan deserved justice. So does every child victim. The question of why resources, media attention, and public engagement vary so dramatically based on victim characteristics remains a troubling aspect of American criminal justice. What has changed since Rowan's death? 17 years have passed. Have the systemic failures that enabled her murder been addressed? Partially. Newton County has improved its child welfare investigation protocols. Teachers are better trained to recognize signs of abuse and neglect. Law enforcement coordination with social services has strengthened. But the fundamental problems remain largely unchanged. Child Protective Services are still underfunded and overwhelmed. Social workers still carry impossible caseloads. The political will to invest seriously in child welfare remains inconsistent. Every year, children die from abuse and neglect that warning signs predicted. Every year, systems fail to intervene in time. Every year, we collectively express outrage, promise to do better, and then return to the status quo. Rowan's death should have been a catalyst for sustained reform. In some ways it was, at least locally, but the broader structural problems that enabled her murder remain largely intact. On April 11, 2025, Rowan Ford would have turned 27 years old. She might have completed college, started a career, perhaps pursued her childhood dream of becoming a veterinarian. She might have married, had children of her own, built a life full of the ordinary moments that add up to a meaningful existence. Instead, she remains frozen in time at 9 years old, a 4th grader who loved purple, who arrived early to school even in winter, who dreamed of helping animals who couldn't help themselves. Sheriff Chris Jennings still carries her school ID card in his pocket every single day. 17 years of daily reminders. 17 years of asking himself what more could have been done. 17 years of looking at that tiny photograph and seeing not just a victim, but a child who deserved better from every adult in her life. In Stella, Missouri, the pink dogwood tree at Triway Elementary blooms every spring. Students who weren't born when Rowan died learn her name, hear her story, and release purple balloons into the sky. The memorial bench at the cemetery bears its simple inscription, "Forever 9, forever loved." These rituals matter. They ensure Rowan isn't forgotten. They remind us that she was a person, not just a case file. But they also serve as monuments to failure, beautiful, painful reminders that systems meant to protect children didn't protect this one. Christopher Collings is dead now, executed by the state of Missouri for crimes he confessed to committing. David Spears is free, living somewhere beyond public scrutiny, his role in that November night forever debated but never fully understood. The questions remain. The contradictions persist. The truth stays frustratingly incomplete. But here's what we know for certain. A 9-year-old girl was failed by the adults who should have protected her. Teachers saw the warning signs. Child Protective Services received the calls. The system responded with band-aids when surgery was needed. And on November 3, 2007, all those small failures accumulated into a tragedy that could have been prevented. Rowan Ford deserved better. She deserved a childhood free from neglect. She deserved adults who saw beyond the immediate symptoms to the deeper problems. She deserved to grow up. Her story doesn't end with justice served or lessons learned or systems fixed. It ends with a marble bench in a small Missouri cemetery, with purple balloons drifting into the sky, with an ID card carried in a sheriff's pocket for 17 years. It ends with a reminder that protecting children requires more than good intentions. It requires action. It requires asking uncomfortable questions. It requires seeing what we'd rather not see and intervening when intervention is difficult. Most of all, it requires remembering that behind every statistic about child abuse, every case number, every true crime story, is a real child who deserved better than what we gave them. Rowan Damia Ford. Born April 11, 1998. Died November 3, 2007. 9 years, 6 months, and 23 days of life. Forever 9. Forever loved. Forever a reminder of how much we failed and how much better we must do. If you or someone you know suspects child abuse or neglect, please don't wait. Contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Be the person who asks the hard questions. Be the person who intervenes. Be the person Rowan needed but never had. If this case moved you, please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Let's keep Rowan's memory alive and continue the conversation about how we can better protect vulnerable children. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Cold Case Desk and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into cases that demand justice and remembrance. Thank you for bearing witness to Rowan's story. These aren't just cold cases. These are lives that mattered. These are families still grieving. These are lessons we cannot afford to forget. Until next time, I'm your host at Cold Case Desk.